Hi everyone, it's Øyvind Martinsen here. In this video I will show you some creative approaches to nature. All the images in this lecture is created in the camera and they are developed in Adobe Lightroom. If you have a zoom lens, you can zoom in or out during the exposure, and the result is an abstract and dynamic image, and you can see the lines in the image is leading into the center of the image. Here I am in the Sarigua Desert in Panama. The desert is a result of deforestation and erosions, but photographically it is interesting. I found this wind-shaped sand dune and I saw the beautiful formations. And another image from the same desert, and I saw the patterns in the cracked soil and they form a strong graphical image. And on the Californian coast I found this wet rock with amazing colors and patterns. This image is also on the Californian coast. There are beautiful patterns and colors in the sand. I saw these arty palm branches on a windy day in the cloud forest of La Amistad National Park in Panama. I used my 600mm lens, and because the branches moved in the wind and I wanted sharp images, I set up the ISO so I could have fast shutter speeds. And I found this large leaf in the Cocle province of Panama, and it has amazing forms and lines. And I think it was better in black and white than in color. Sometimes it's better to point the camera upwards. Even though this tree is dry and dead, it is still beautiful. I photographed it in the warm golden hour light one winter evening in Norway. And here I played with some rock formations in Telemark, Norway. An early morning light defines the forms of the rocks. A colorful heliconia flower inside the dense rainforest of Saraoya National Park in Panama. I went in for a close-up to capture the arty lines and formations. Here I found some wind-shaped arrow-like snow formation on a frozen lake in Norway. And as we see, nature is the best artist. Now, let's say goodbye to sharpness. Let's play jazz. Here I move the lens sideways in short and fast movements back and forth along the lines during the exposure. And this is the bark of an oak tree, and I turn the camera so the lines appears as diagonals. Then I move the lens sideways in short and fast movements back and forth along the lines during the exposure. And here I use the same technique. I move the camera in short and fast motions up and down during the exposure. In this spring forest, I move the camera in short and fast movements up and down during the exposure. And normally I follow the lines with my movements in the image when I use this technique. And this is an old method you can use to create dancing trees abstractions. And I was inside an old spruce forest in Norway, and I moved the camera in one motion upwards during the exposure. I used the same technique on this group of birch trees. I moved the camera in one motion upwards during the exposure. Here I was in Fall Creek in California, and now let's take it a little further. In this image the camera is in motion downwards in the first half of the exposure. Then I lock the ball head on the tripod so the camera is in a fixed position in the second half of the exposure. With this method you can create a fairy tale forest out of a static forest. And here I use the same method. The camera is in motion downwards in the first half of the exposure. Then I lock the ball head on the tripod so the camera is in a fixed position the second half of the exposure. And I converted the image to black and white in Adobe Lightroom and added a sepia tone. You can also play with two fixed positions. In the first half of the exposure, the camera was fixed in a position on the flowers, and in the second half, the camera is pointing at another section of the forest. You have to switch fast between the two positions. Here I am working on a South African flower, and I move the camera sideways, back and forth during the exposure. I also use the flash and I set it on rear curtain sync. Then the flash fires at the end of the exposure and not in the beginning. Then you get a combination of softness created by the motion and sharpness created by the flash. And here's the same technique. I move the camera in one vertical motion during the exposure to create an abstract softness. I also use the flash and I set it on rear curtain sync. Then the flash fires at the end of exposure and not in the beginning. Then you get the combination of softness created by the motion and sharpness created by the flash. Here I used a variable neutral density filter to achieve long shutter speed for this image. The rock is in the water on a windy day with a lot of waves, and it appears like it is a mountaintop over the clouds. And this is the same rock as the previous, but the camera was in a fixed position the first half of the exposure, and then I rotated it quickly 180 degrees, and then it stayed in another fixed position the second half of the exposure. To be able to do this, you need to have a tripod attachment on the lens and not on the camera, so you can rotate the lens during the exposure. This is a long exposure of water foam in a river stream. The foam takes on some abstract patterns as it moves around in the water in different streams. In this image, the camera stayed in a fixed position on the tripod. And here is the same river stream, but here I follow the foam with my lens as it moves in the stream. And here is another with the same method. I follow the foam as it moves during the exposure. When the camera is exposing, you cannot see the picture. I work with the camera on the tripod, but I loosen the ball head so I can move the camera freely. You have to follow the foam's way instinctively during the exposure. If you take several pictures, no pictures are similar. And here is water in hard form. I played with the frozen lakeshore in the Lake Vansjø in Norway, and I saw the curved lines and the contrast, and I pre-visualized a black and white image. Here are the reflections of all the trees in the Lake Vansjø in Norway. I took this image an early spring morning on a long exposure. In the development process, I rotated the image 180 degrees, and we have a more abstract forest. And here are reeds and reflections in the Lake Vansjø in Norway, and reflections are always fun to work with. More reeds and reflection in the Lake Vansjø. I like this because the reeds above the water surface and the reflections form cubic shapes. I took this photograph on a foggy autumn morning in the Lake Vansjø, and I saw the group of reeds and the reflections. It became a quiet and poetic image, and sometimes less is more. This is a river stream in Cerro Oyan National Park in Panama. I used my 600mm lens, and the blue is the reflections of the sky, and the yellowish green is the reflections of the sunlit rainforest. Here I am at a beautiful waterfall, not so far from my home in the Cocle province of Panama. I made a simple but strong composition, and the long shutter speed at 6 seconds give the waterfall a soft appearance. The clamped rock in the upper part also adds energy to the composition. I spot metered the light with manual light metering in the camera on the sunlit flower. This was right before sunset, and the sunlight did only shine on the flowers and not on the ground. That created a good contrast, and I increased the contrast further on in the development process. Here I rotated the camera with a simple rotation during the exposure around the center of the image. It is an interesting method. Much more interesting is it when you rotate the camera and at the same time move the camera downwards and sideways. Then you get the lines of a cubic parable. And here is the same method with rotation of the camera, and at the same time I move the camera downwards and sideways during the exposure. And it's some awesome abstractions. And thank you for being with me in this video, and I'll see you soon in the next.